Hello and welcome back to our bookshop in Tring. I'm Ben Morehouse. So we've got another author interview today, and we're talking music with the brilliant Craig Brown. He's written a book called 1, 2, 3, 4: The Beatles in Time, biography of the Fab Four. Now he's going to be talking to a good friend of ours and BBC journalist Mike Naylor.
Well, thank you, Ben, and Craig, welcome. Thousands of books, of course, have been written about the Beatles in the last 58 years. So why did you want to write this one? What was your pitch to the publisher?
Well, it was rather an odd pitch because I was actually writing a book about the Thames, and I'd started from the source. So I was around the outskirts of London, around Putney. And I asked my editor if he wanted to join me in a walk for that day's walk, and he did. And I said to him on the walk, "Oh, I've got a really good idea for the next book, which is book about the Beatles, done in a similar kind of kaleidoscopic way that I did my book about Princess Margaret, which is one I'd written before." And then the next day he said, "Oh, it's 50 years next April from the time the Beatles broke up. Do you want to do the book now instead of the Thames?" And the Thames was slightly faltering. I mean, I was enjoying the walk rather more than the writing. And so I rose to the challenge. So it wasn't really so much a pitch as just a kind of vague idea that they'd be kind of suitable for this treatment. And so I suppose it's the treatment more than the content which gives it, a unique quality, if it has one, in that I don't do it strictly chronologically, and I introduce kind of odd essays or personal reminiscences or travelogues. I went to Hamburg and Liverpool, or reminiscences by fans, and so it's a sort of a kind of smorgasbord or something of a book. And lots of 150 short chapters.
That's so it's not obviously charting the Beatles' musical development or reappraising their albums or their songs. It's more about their relationships with the people that were part of their story, which I really, really enjoyed. But you list your sources, and there are many, stretching over 7 pages. So, did you read lots and lots of Beatle biographies and books?
Yeah, I mean, I spent the first 6 months just reading Beatles stuff. I knew probably more than an average person, but not as much as an expert. And of course, I'd sort of grown up with them. Yes, and really I read all the sort of major ones, but I love all the really obscure autobiography, like an autobiography by their hairdresser, Leslie Cavendish. Those are the ones. I like the books by people who'd met them, particularly, rather than other biographers. Or Ronnie Spector, Phil Spector's wife. There's a chapter or two in her book about being with John. I think it was just before they set off for America. And you just get lots of fun stuff from those books.
Yeah.
So
you also spent several hours, I think, on YouTube, yes?
Oh yes, well you do get hooked on the Beatles on YouTube. I'm not just their kind of videos, but also you can see a lot of their press conferences when they first hit America, where they were so kind of full of fun and self-confidence, and they were such a gang. And those are very touching, and you can see how quick-witted they were and how uncowed they were by being in a foreign country, or in America, suddenly being the most famous people in America, I suppose, after whoever was LBJ.
Elvis.
Or Elvis,
I watched a couple the other day. They did a 30-minute set on the Mike and Bernie Winters show about 64, 65. And then after the Beatles split up, I saw one with George Harrison on some chat show, and with Paul Simon, and they played Homeward Bound. It's amazing.
Oh, really? That's lovely. I mean, I think you could go on discovering Beatles stuff like that for the rest of your life, and really just on YouTube, because I never saw that. I got very hooked on things like watching the video for Hey Jude, or All You Need Is Love. I did a whole chapter actually on Lady Madonna video, where they were obviously quite stoned, I then didn't use the chapter, but I think they become more and more. Most singers, I think, don't become more interesting with time, but I think they do, and not just because I was writing about them. They're intriguing. I mean, partly their characters are so diverse from each other, and so each, unlike Princess Margaret, in my previous book, who was just one person and basically, a very limited person, each of them was extraordinary in a different way, and so you become very fascinated by them.
So you also went to Liverpool and you went to Hamburg, as you say. I wanted you to talk a bit about those visits, because I found it very interesting too. When I went there, you went to the National Trust owned houses, 20 Forthlin Road, where Paul McCartney used to live, and the Mendits, where John Lennon used to live. And the two people that run the tours are husband and wife. There's a lot of secrecy. They take the phones off you and that. So what did you glean from being in those houses?
I had actually been before, about 5 years ago, before I even thought of doing a book. And, I do find there was some controversy about whether the National Trust should buy these essentially dull houses. They're not great architectural buildings like most stately homes. But I definitely think that was the right decision. And there's something very moving about going to, in a way, especially Paul's house, which is the more modest, and just seeing where he came from and, and then what he became. And I think that's tremendous. But they do have amazing kind of strictures, far more than in any, Buckingham Palace or Windsor Castle or something. You're not allowed to take phones in, you're not allowed to take photographs. I was then taking notes, and they sort of called me up in front of everyone else in a slightly embarrassing way, saying, "Excuse me, what are you doing?" And I said, "I'm taking notes." Who gave you permission to do that? It was, and it was absurd, I think. And especially the notes were simply on their commentary. I was taking a few notes about the decoration of the house and things like that. The man who was in charge of John's home said, well, that he was writing a book, and he had lots of exclusive information which he was giving us, but actually none of it was. It's all stuff which had been in books. And anyway, you think, well, if you're telling 12,000 people a year this stuff, you can hardly claim that it's private. Anyway, but the great thing about being a writer, the great thing about being a writer is, as someone once said, you can turn your worst moments into money. And so from this embarrassing thing, I could at least use it. You can, if not into money, you can just turn it into words and make it. I hope I made it funny. I hope I wasn't too harsh on them, because they were perfectly professional guides. They just had ideas slightly above their station, I think.
The House of McCartney is adorned with really interesting black and white photographs that his brother Mike McCartney took. But I think in Lennon's, what is really interesting is you see that his writings from when he was sort of 10 and 11. He used to keep a daily journal, didn't he? And he made fun of things, and he was influenced by listening to the Goon Show and that. And he loved puns, and lots of that came out in songs like I Am the Walrus years later. That was fascinating, because they're all original handwritten artifacts.
Yes. I think it's a very interesting side of John's character, how busy he was, and as a child, he was a kind of naughty schoolboy, but at the same time he was doing a kind of unofficial school magazine, and he was doing, as you were saying, writing these stories. And even when he was really sort of in his heroin years, in the sort of very late 60s and then a bit beyond, he was still writing a lot of letters to people, or fans would write, and he would write 2 or 3 pages back to them. And so he had all this energy, and not just artistic energy, but, well, perhaps you can't divorce it, but just actual energy to get up and do things. And I think that's a very interesting side of his character. I do have one of the chapters in my book is all about puns, actually, and he was a real fan of Spike Milligan. Once actually reviewed a Spike Milligan book for the New York Times. And of course, Spike Milligan had a sort of manic well, he did have manic depression, and I think the puns were in some way that inability not to pun, was in some way a manifestation of his mental turmoil, and I think it might have been true of John as well, in that a pun means two things at the same time, and I think if you have a sort of slightly split personality, then you're drawn towards punning.
You went to the Beatles International Week and fan conventions, and give me a flavour of that, because it's extraordinary that all these people in their 60s and 70s, maybe older, come from all around the world to maybe browse and buy Beatles memorabilia and swap stories all these years later. It's incredible.
I mean, the thing which is really striking, and then of course I got very interested in auction catalogues and things, is quite how much these things go for. I mean, a guitar might go for, used by Paul or George, might go for £800,000, and lyrics of a big song would go for roughly the same, I think. I mean, but I mean, at the convention, they'd have things like, I remember there was one which was, I think, the autographs of, I think it was all four Beatles, it might have only been three, on a piece of writing paper from the Georges V Hotel where they were staying in early '64. And that was selling for something like £6,000, just their autographs on a piece of paper. I mean, wow. It is rather extraordinary. And that was maybe one of the more expensive things at the Liverpool, in this sort of hotel hallway. But it is extraordinary that people just want a little bit of the Beatles. And so in a way, they're like kind of contemporary saints. It's like having, medieval knights wanting relics of from the True Cross or something. People want to touch.
Did you ever meet them?
I've only met, well, I can hardly call it a meeting, but I was once, when I was about, I suppose, 14, no, maybe a bit older, 15, 16, Mike McCartney, who was then called Mike McGear, Paul's brother, was in a group called Grimm's, which he was in with Neil Innes and Viv Stanshall of the Bonzo Dog Band, Roger McGough, poet, who was in the Scaffold with him. And so I was mad on Grimm's, and I remember once going to a Grimm's concert in Victoria in London, and I saw, before the curtain went up, there weren't very many people in the audience, and I suddenly saw Paul and Linda about 2 rows ahead. And I'd been to a Roxy Music concert the night before, and so I had this photo signed by Roxy Music, and I said to Paul, would you mind signing it? And he was very genial and nice. And so stupidly, I've lost it, but it had all, Brian Ferry and Eno and people's signatures. And then he wrote, "And me too, Paul McCartney." And of course, I haven't got it anymore. So you could hardly call that a meeting. I couldn't have made a book out of that meeting. But,
fascinating story, though, quite a short one, but with an interesting letter, because your parents saw John and Yoko coming out of a hotel in Suffolk, near to where you are now. And is it a letter that was written possibly suggesting that Lennon might one day be assassinated?
Oh God, I can't even remember. Yes, I think he had. That was nothing to do with my, my father might have written him the letter, but didn't. I think that I'm now struggling to think about. I think they had, basically it was in Long Melford in Suffolk, and my father was on a kind of shooting, he used to shoot pigeons and things with Brent. So he was trying to get into the hotel while they were trying to get out. And I remember him coming back and saying, "But I stood my ground." I mean, he was very anti-John and Yoko. And so they had to make way for my dad. But I now can't actually remember the bit that you're referring to. But I think that morning, John and Yoko had got a letter warning them that he was going to be assassinated, or maybe I can't quite remember. Perhaps you can remember better than me.
Yeah, I can't find the reference to that. Let's talk about some of the other people that I really found interesting. We might come to Brian Epstein later, but once the Beatles were successful and become established, obviously there's a whole host of classical music writers who adored them and said how complex their vocal harmonies were, and then another lot that didn't like them. And there was a lot of other sort of snobbish writers around at the time who were very critical. But Paul, of course, went out with Jane Asher, and for 3 years, I think he was able to live in her parents' house. And her father was a doctor, and her mother was a musician. She'd actually taught George Martin, producer, to play the oboe, I think. And that was quite important, I think, for him to be able to absorb a lot of other interesting musical and non-musical mores and knowledge about the world, wasn't it?
Yeah, I think when he came to London, and he stayed in London, the others got houses outside London, and they got married, and so they were living rather, in a way, kind of bourgeois lives. He stayed in London, and he really fell on his feet, I think, because he met Jane Asher, and then her parents said he could come and live in their house, right in the middle of London, in Wigmore Street. And they were both very cultured people. His father actually, her father, Dr. Richard Asher, actually invented the term Munchausen syndrome, which is now commonly used term. And so he was a great specialist in his field. And they kind of took Paul under their wing, and they just taught. He was the most intellectually curious of the Beatles, I think, particularly at that time. And he just lapped up, he was in his early 20s, he was just lapping up all the music and the books and that London and the world could offer. So I think he was in a very happy place. I say it somewhere in the book that if I could be any Beatle at any time, it would be living with Jane Asher in Wigmore Street.
Yeah.
Because the world was his oyster. And all these songs, Yesterday came to him in his sleep and while staying with them. And they had a music room downstairs, and I think he had a piano in his bedroom. And so he could compose away, and the songs were just pouring out of him, these amazing melodies. So it was an incredibly fruitful time for him.
What about Lennon at this stage, before they went to India, and even before Sergeant Pepper? Lennon had written Help, 65, and so he was less comfortable with fame, wasn't he, from more or less the beginning, and felt that people were beginning to exploit them, and there were hangers-on, I think.
I think he was less comfortable in his own skin anyway. I mean, from the word go. He'd had an unhappy childhood. His father had left his mother. His mother was very flighty. He'd ended up with Aunt Mimi, kind of slightly controversial figure. And then of course his mother died. Actually, some months after Paul's mother had died, but his mother had died very suddenly, and he wasn't living with his mother. Whereas Paul's family life was very happy, and so Paul was secure. John was basically insecure, and so I think he was therefore going to be insecure with fame. That didn't mean to say that he wasn't. And I think they were one of the things I've noticed with a lot of reading about a lot of pop stars, even Paul Simon, who you mentioned, or Bob Dylan. They tend to be very, very ambitious characters. You don't get to the top without real drive. You don't just get there by chance. And I think John and Paul both had a drive to succeed. I mean, you can tell it from when they were still schoolboys. They were writing a song by Lennon and McCartney at the top, as if it was already, like George Gershwin would write a song. So as if they were already famous. And so I'm not sure that, so he might have been uneasy with fame, but that's not to say that he didn't want it. And also, I think in those early days, you can see how delighted they were by it, including John. They liked being on stage. They liked being at press conferences. They liked doing their films. They were very happy. And probably, I guess that it was the happiest time of John's life would be sort of 63, 64. But then of course you get used to everything. And, once obviously either of us would probably love, 10,000 girls screaming at us or chanting along with our songs, but you then get used to it, and then you see the downsides. So the big downside for them was the girls would scream and they couldn't even hear themselves playing, and so their music was getting nowhere. They weren't progressing, and so fame then obviously it has its huge downsides.
So let's talk about the Maharishi Mahesh Yogi, an Indian teacher of transcendental meditation. The connection was made through George Harrison, and they went to India, and McCartney and Lennon then wrote a lot of the songs separately for the White Album. Then they met him again at Bangor University, as a matter of fact, where he was speaking, and all four Beatles went up there. It was during that weekend when the phone rang to say that Brian Epstein had died. You seem to indicate in the book, Craig, that it was at that stage that maybe the Maharishi was a bit of a con man and a hanger-on, and he tried to be the father figure, replacing Brian.
I think actually, I don't want to be pedantic, but I think you got it the wrong way around, that actually they saw the Maharishi briefly in London, then they went to Bangor for a weekend, and it was then sort of 6 months after that they went, and at that time Brian Epstein died, and then a few months later they went to India. Sorry, that's it. It's completely irrelevant to your question.
No, well, that's fine. But
I'm always so pleased that I know something, that I can remember something correctly. A lot of, I suppose any biography is a bit of detective work, because almost anything that happens on any day of the Beatles' lives, there are different accounts of. As Paul McCartney said, I think I quote him, if everyone's in an earthquake, everyone has a different experience of the earthquake. And so quite why they eventually fell out with the Maharishi is hard to say, but I think John, there was this rumor that he had tried to get off with, I think it was Mia Farrow's sister, this holy man. But I think John rather used the rumor. He was getting slightly bored. Ringo had already left, and I think Paula had. And he said, okay, we're out. And then George then rather regretted. And so they were it's quite mean to the Maharishi. They just, having been there quite a few weeks, they just said, okay, we're off. We don't like you anymore. George, I think, then regretted it. But I mean, John was a very commanding character and a very capricious character. So he could love someone one day and then hate them the next. And so Paul, so the Maharishi slightly fell foul of that. I think a lot of those kind of gurus are sort of half con men and half genuine. And I suspect the Maharishi was like that. You could have got something from him, and he wasn't wholly bad, but he also had a slight eye on the main chance. He certainly loved the idea that the Beatles were there, and he loved fame in a way that probably spiritual figures shouldn't love it quite so much.
Next one, I suppose, is Yoko Ono, and the Beatles, or John, gave her, I think, a £5,000 grant to stage an art exhibition in London, and he said that would pay her off. But people think that she was responsible for the breakup of the Beatles, but you say in the book that would have happened anyway. But what was your take on Yoko Ono? She was desperate to stay with John, and I think from that first meeting claimed that she knew they were meant to be together, and she wrote to him every day for months and months, didn't she?
I think so. I mean, there are obviously, like Aunt Mimi, but more so. Yoko has her fans and her detractors. I'd put myself in the detractor camp, that I'm not a fan. I don't think her art is, or certainly her music, and also her art, is of any significance at all. And in fact, the only bits of the book which the lawyers stepped in with, saying you can't put that, was when I was suggesting she was plagiarizing. A lot of the art that she's seen as being the great original, and in fact, she was plagiarizing people like Christo, who's just died the other day. And in the same way, you get different opinions about. I mean, she always claimed not to have known who John was when she saw him, but I mean, I think it's pretty good evidence that she knew exactly who the Beatles were, and she did have an eye on the main chants. But maybe that's how you get on in the artistic world. Yeah, so I think she rather targeted him, but he was in a mood to be targeted. So he was, it takes two to tumble, and he suddenly tumbled.
Lots of great quotes as well, from Lennon's first wife, Cynthia, and so on. And really, really interesting stuff that I didn't know much about it in terms of the whole madness of what the Apple Corporation was going to be, not just the record label, but the fact that it was going to have these shops, there was going to be Apple Electronics, there was going to be Apple cars, Apple limousines, and they just had no business idea at all, really, did they? And the management that they had, just kind of until Alan Klein stepped in to wind it up, let them, the fans and people, come in and make money out of them and screw them, really.
Yeah, I think that basically, I think, there's always a danger in saying, what if, or, what would have happened if such as that. But I think you can say that if Brian Epstein hadn't died, they wouldn't have got into the whole Apple business. I mean, you could see how they got into it, because their accountant said, look, you've got lots of money. It was then, 99% tax rate or something like that. They said, spend the money and then it won't be taxed. It was a normal thing. And so they then thought, let's start a business. And it started out very philanthropic in a way. They wanted to give lots of musicians a chance, and then they wanted to do fashion and things. And actually, I think the record label was an artistic success. They had great people. I remember buying Billy Preston and the Radha Krishna Temple, and it shows the power of the Beatles at the time. That monks chanting Hare Krishna could get into the top 5. I think it got to number 2 or 3. And that was on Apple. Mary Hopkin, really good singer. I still listen to Mary Hopkin. She was on Apple. But they also they knew music, so they knew what they wanted, and they could guide it. But they didn't know anything about the fashion business, all these incredibly competitive areas they got into. And it was a disaster, financial disaster. And I think Brian Epstein would never have allowed them into that. It's also obviously really boring being a businessman if you're a musician. I mean, obviously, some people have the capacity to be interested by business, but they didn't. And so they were very hands-off. And so they allowed these either incompetents or charlatans, or a bit of both, to take over.
One of which was this Greek guy, I think, called Magic Alex, who promised to build them the state-of-the-art studio, which we won't go into. It never got built, and they got rid of him. But and of course, Charles Manson comes into this story, Craig. He listened to the Beatles. He came out of prison, and then this all leads to whether things were said at the end of Beatle records going backwards, and this whole thing about Paul McCartney died in 1966, and you've got 3 really very good pages of reasons why people who believed that, why they thought he was dead.
Yeah, it's a funny thing about all conspiracy theories. If you believe them in a concentrated way, you can always find the evidence to support them. I mean, quite clearly, Paul McCartney wasn't dead. But there were about 35 perfectly good reasons to suppose that he was. Things like the number plate on Abbey Road saying 28, and 28 IF, and they'd said, well, he would have been 28 if he had been alive, and that he was wearing, on Abbey Road cover, he was wearing no shoes and wearing black, which was a sort of Buddhist funeral ceremony, and John in white was the pallbearer, and all that kind of thing. The reasons went on and on and on, and there are still people who still believe, and a book was written last year by an Italian woman who still believe that the current Paul McCartney is just an actor, that Paul McCartney did die in 68 or whenever it was, 69, and they hired this actor to be Paul McCartney. And people genuinely believe this stuff. And it is, I mean, that it was a kind of emanation of the lunacy of the times as well, of people's readiness to believe. I mean, Charles Manson, you know, just misinterpreted all these Beatles lyrics just to, you know, he thought there was going to be a civil war between the blacks and the whites in America, and that he would lead the blacks, and the Beatles were signaling. Oddly enough, I just got an email about an hour ago from someone who knew this couple who came to the Apple headquarters, who I mention in the book. And this person knew them at the time, and he just gave me more information about them. And he said that they'd come from California, I think, because of listening to George's quite obscure song, Blue Jay Way. And that has a chorus saying, please don't be long, don't be so very long. Have a go. And they were sure that he was singing it to them. So they took the first flight over and came into Apple, and then kind of befriended the Beatles. The Beatles were so kind of, I suppose, semi-drugs talking, but they were just so gullible, really, among that kind of people, person. And I think John eventually let them, bought an island, and he let them stay there. Anyway, those were the days.
Wow, extraordinary, yes. The Manson, of course, was tied into sort of biblical references, allegedly, to in the Book of Revelation and Helter Skelter. That you explain that really well for those who didn't know about that time in their career, Abbey Road and all the rest of it.
And it is the danger. It's the danger of I mean, I love nonsense in the Sir Edward Lewis Carroll tradition, which John Lennon was very keen on too. But there is a danger in writing nonsense, is that people can then, it can mean whatever they want it to mean, and it can mean very mad things, and that was what happened with Manson.
Got lots of good things from fans, you know, again, who thought that they waited outside the studio or wherever the Beatles might be, you know, because I think Paul is writing for me his songs, and I'm going to marry him. Lots of girls fell into that trap, didn't they?
Oh yeah, yeah.
Lots
almost more than didn't fall into it, I think. Yeah. I've got a great friend, Mary Killen, who's now become famous on Gogglebox. But I asked her to write a chapter of her own. She's in the book under Mary Wood, which is her married name. But yeah, she was a doctor's daughter in Larne in Northern Ireland. And when the Beatles came to Northern Ireland, I think they only played Belfast once. But she was convinced that Paul, she was about 13 or so, she thought that she was desperate to marry Paul, was convinced that Paul would want to marry her the minute he saw her. And because her father was a doctor, she had imagined that Paul would fall over or get some kind of bruising, and Dr. Killen would take him into the house, and then he'd set eyes on Mary and then fall in love, and they'd get married. But this kind of fantasy was completely common for Beatles fans, and I think Mary thinks it's because the Beatles they weren't sort of rough like the Rolling Stones. You know, they were the perfect kind of prepubescent girls' fantasy, because they're almost like girls. You know, they were sort of clean and unsexual in a funny way.
He also, on that point, the man that turned down the Beatles at Decca, he then signed the Rolling Stones on the advice and a tip-off from George Harrison.
Yes, I know, and the Rolling, Mick Jagger's still kind of slightly chippy about the Beatles. He should be very grateful. Yeah, so George Harrison, I think it was a beauty contest or something. He was judging next to Dick James, and I suppose George Harrison felt a bit sorry for him to have, you know, lost the Beatles. You know, saying I think he wrote that famous thing saying I think beat groups are out, or you know, they've had their day. So George just said, "Oh, well, you should see this group playing in a pub in Richmond," and he went there and he signed them up. And then, of course, the Beatles gave the Rolling Stones their first single, "I Want to Be Your Man." So, so all this, I mean, I treated in the book this continuing argument between fans of the Stones and fans of the Beatles on which is better. But I think I'm quite convincing in saying that the Beatles both offered more and were at least partly responsible for the Stones' success.
And then the sort of Stones, maybe after Sgt. Pepper did Satanic Majesty's Bequest, and then Let It Be became Let It Bleed for them.
Yeah,
So
yeah. No, they were always running behind. They were always running behind them. I have a chapter in the book about the Rolling Stones were premiering their new album in a nightclub in Tottenham Court Road, and then Paul McCartney came in just after everyone had been listening to this album, and it'd gone down well and everything. Paul McCartney came in with the Beatles' new single, which was Hey Jude, and said to the disc jockey, "Do you want to play this? It's the first time." And of course, the whole room went silent, everyone, and the whole focus of attention went on to the Beatles, and it was still meant to be the Rolling Stones' big night. And so you can see, you know, if you're the second biggest group in the world, you're jealous of the biggest group in the world. It's human nature.
And Jimmy Nicol, of course, was a guy that stood in for the Beatles and stood in for Ringo when he wasn't well on a tour. Played, what, 10 concerts? Did you eventually manage to track Jimmy down? You did, didn't you?
Well, they were suggesting he's slightly like the Loch Ness Monster. He's hard to put your finger on. I think it's one of the features of the book, and in some ways of my writing as a whole. I'm very interested, and probably more than other Beatles, definitely more than other Beatles writers, in the people who fell by the wayside of the Beatles. I mean, not because of the Beatles being vindictive or anything, but they were just kind of caught in the wave, and their lives were tossed around. So quite a lot of the old guard, like Cliff Richard. I mean, obviously Cliff Richard's had a successful career since, but he was way bigger than the Beatles. I mean, he'd done 2 films before they'd made their first single, and he was almost exactly the same age as John. So he was a huge star. And then by 1966, when the Beatles are doing all these amazing songs, he's sort of starring in the Palladium in Cinderella. He's become a kind of all-round family entertainer. And another person, so there are people like that I'm interested in. But Jimmy Nicol had this extraordinary career. He was playing sort of part-time for Georgie Fame, not really getting anywhere. Suddenly Ringo becomes very ill. The day before, they have to set off on a tour of Scandinavia and Australia, and they have to get a drummer very, very quickly. They hit on Jimmy Nicol. They give him a Beatles haircut, fit him out with Beatles suit. And so for 10 days, he becomes a Beatle, and with all the fame and all the screaming, and he's allowed it. He's part of the press conferences and everything. And it sort of went to his head. And so when he came back, he formed his own band. He paid the band too much, put them on a regular salary. And within a year, he'd gone bankrupt and his wife had left him. And then he went to Mexico, and it was an awful downhill slope. And you feel that if he hadn't had this big break, then his life might have been perfectly happy. And it's just interesting, people's fate, I think. I mean, in a way, it's what all literature is about, but it becomes particularly interesting in those people around the Beatles. It applies to Brian Epstein as well, that if Brian Epstein hadn't had this great discovery, I begin and end the book in the same way, of him going down the cavern steps for the first time. If he hadn't had this great discovery, of course, no one would have heard of Brian Epstein. He wouldn't have had this amazing success and thrill, but he also might still be alive.
He went down those steps in 1961 with his assistant. They said the Beatles were awful, yes, but we liked them. There was the personality shone through. And he was a man that had been to public school in Shropshire and was sort of more interested in classical music. You've got some fantastic stories in this book, Craig. I mean, talking about those ones who went by the wayside or fate, there was the policeman who then became a postman, Eric Clegg, who ran over John Lennon's mother, the Detective Sergeant Norman Pilcher, who busted the Beatles a couple of times for drugs and tried to get other musicians as well put behind, but he probably planted some evidence. When you talk about the Beatles' appearance on the Ed Sullivan Show as well in the early 60s, there's a whole stack of people that later became famous and were well-known musicians and still are, like Bruce Springsteen, Chrissie Hynde, Tom Petty, Billy Joel, and the Fogerty Brothers from Creedence Clearwater Revival. I mean, this is extraordinary research.
Yes, and I think in England we don't quite understand the impact they had in America. Because in England their fame was relatively slow. I mean, they'd obviously done Hamburger, but they'd then got a couple of singles which didn't get into the top 10, and then they had "I Want to Hold Your Hand," which obviously did. It's a huge success. So they were then famous in England, but it took a bit of time. In America, they became almost famous in a day. They arrived in America, and just all America sort of fell over backwards for them, and particularly from this one Ed Sullivan show, and it was extraordinary. And it's never been before or since. There's never been anything like that sudden impact. And so I just scouted around for accounts by teenagers or youngsters watching the television that night, and the people you say, the Fogertys, the Creedence Clearwater, and Bruce Springsteen and Chrissie Hynde, they've all written in their autobiographies about the impact of seeing them on television and what their fathers thought, and because of course half America was thought the Beatles were appalling. I mean, the older generation, it was huge generational divide.
Well, I think you capture the 60s and all of these stories brilliantly in this book. We've only really scratched the surface. You've got the time that the Beatles met Cassius Clay before his big world title fight against Sonny Liston, and then the two meetings that didn't go quite so well when all four Beatles met Elvis, and then when John, who was a big fan of Brigitte Bardot, met her. That didn't go down too well because he was so nervous. So he dropped some acid, I think, before the meeting took place. So it didn't go well at all. All these sorts of incredible stories in here. And you mentioned, of course, not only do we have these Beatle conventions and fan conventions, that there are around about 1,000 Beatles tribute bands now. And I know you've seen maybe several. How do you feel when you see them? I mean, the good ones, the Cavern Club Beatles and the Bootleg Beatles, they're pretty good. But how does it make you feel as a fan who bought their albums for real when they came out?
It is rather extraordinary. I mean, I saw the Bootleg Beatles about 10 years ago, and then when I went up to Liverpool for the fan convention, there were any number of, there must have been 200 different bands from all over the world, Indonesia and South America and Portugal. But when you see it, so obviously some are just sort of slightly peculiar, or all-girl Beatles bands, or but
Really?
the very best ones are amazing. I mean, it is like going back in time. So first you sort of, I in a way I came to scoff, because you're with lots of fans, I suppose average age, sort of late 60s. And they all look like Ronald Reagan or something. And you think, well, what's everyone kidding themselves for? But then those good Beatles groups are so good, and they just kind of, it's almost like a kind of spiritualist thing. They seem to be inhabited by the Beatles, and especially at a distance and with my fading eyesight, they look like them too. And so you feel as if you are being transported back in time. I mean, to an extraordinary extent. I mean, I think that, and like I was saying about the Beatles' houses being moving and touching when you're there, I think going to the really good Beatles tribute groups, there is something almost mystical about it.
We're talking to Craig Brown. Fantastic to have your company today and to talk with you about the Beatles. 1, 2, 3, 4, The Beatles in Time by Craig Brown, our guest. Thank you so much. Real good.
Well, thank you very much. Thank you.
A massive thanks to Mike and to Craig for that wonderful interview. You can get hold of 1, 2, 3, 4 from the bookshop. Give us a call on 01442 827 653. All the purchase blurb is in the information below the video. Thanks ever so much. We've got so much more to come, and we'll see you next time.